October 17th, 1948, 11:47 p.m. New York Tribune, 9th floor. Michael Sullivan sat alone at his desk, typewriter in front of him, coffee gone cold, cigarette burning in the ashtray, and one file folder. Thick, heavy, dangerous. Inside that folder, everything you needed to destroy a king. Arrest records, police reports, witness statements, financial estimates, all about one man, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, the man who controlled the numbers racket, the gangster who somehow walked the streets like a hero while running an empire built on illegal gambling. Sullivan had been working on this story for 3 weeks. His editor wanted it Monday morning. "Give me the truth about Bumpy Johnson," he'd said. "Everyone thinks he's some kind of Robin Hood. Show them what he really is." Sullivan thought it would be easy. Gangster story. Classic formula. Show the crimes. Show the victims. Show the money. Expose the myth. He had the facts. Bumpy Johnson, 43 years old. Multiple arrests. Time in Alcatraz. Known associate of organized crime figures. Current operation. Numbers racket. Illegal gambling. Estimated revenue. $500,000 a year. That's $6 million in today's money. Criminal. Clear-cut. Open and shut. Sullivan had written stories like this 100 times. This one should have been no different. But it was different because 3 days ago, Sullivan made one mistake. He went to Harlem. Not to his office, not to police headquarters, to Harlem, to see for himself, to talk to people, to verify the facts. And what he found there didn't match the file on his desk. Not even close. Now Sullivan sat in his office at 11:47 p.m., staring at his typewriter. 2 versions of the same story in his head. Version 1, the gangster who exploited his community. The criminal who needed to be exposed. Version 2, something else entirely. Something that didn't fit the narrative. Something that made him question everything he thought he knew about crime and justice. Sullivan had a choice to make. Write the story his editor wanted. The story the facts supported. The story that would probably win awards. Or write the truth. The complicated, messy, uncomfortable truth that didn't fit in a newspaper headline. This is the story of what happened when a white reporter from Brooklyn went to Harlem to expose a legend, and discovered that sometimes the villain is the only hero the system allows to exist. Before we get to what changed Sullivan's mind, you need to understand what he knew going in. The facts, the evidence, the case against Bumpy Johnson. Sullivan's file was comprehensive. Starting with arrests, Bumpy Johnson's criminal record went back to 1924. Robbery, assault, weapons, charges, conspiracy. He'd served time in Sing Sing, in Alcatraz, in federal prisons from New York to California, 24 years of documented criminal activity. Then there was the numbers racket, the policy game, illegal gambling that ran through Harlem like a second currency. Here's how it worked. Every day, people bet on 3-digit numbers. A penny, a nickel, a dime. If your number hit based on stock market results or horse race outcomes, you won 600 to 1. Simple, addictive, technically illegal, and Bumpy Johnson controlled it. According to police estimates, the numbers racket in Harlem generated $50,000 a week. That's $2.6 million a week in today's money. And Bumpy took a percentage of all of it. Sullivan had interviewed police officers. They called Bumpy the most dangerous man in Harlem. He'd interviewed federal prosecutors. They called him untouchable. We can never get witnesses to testify. He'd reviewed court documents showing Bumpy's connections to organized crime families. The Genovese family, the Luciano family. Every fact pointed to the same conclusion. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who'd built an empire on illegal gambling and intimidation. But here's what bothered Sullivan. The numbers didn't match the narrative. If Bumpy was so dangerous, why did police rarely arrest him? If he was so violent, why were there so few documented victims? If he was so hated, why did witnesses refuse to testify not out of fear, but out of loyalty? Sullivan had covered organized crime for 8 years. He knew what mob-controlled neighborhoods looked like. Terrified residents, broken windows, businesses shuttered by extortion. But when Sullivan researched Harlem, he found something different. Businesses thriving, community festivals, jazz clubs packed every night, and everywhere, the same name, Bumpy Johnson. Not as a threat, as a protector. That didn't make sense. Criminals don't protect communities. They exploit them. So Sullivan added one more item to his research plan. Go to Harlem, talk to people, find the victims. Every gangster has victims. Sullivan just needed to find Bumpy's. That's when everything changed. Because Sullivan went to Harlem looking for victims. And he found something else entirely. October 14th, 1948. 2:03 ppm. 2:03 ppm. Sullivan took the subway from Brooklyn to Harlem, 125th Street Station. He'd been to Harlem before, covering stories, interviewing witnesses, but he'd never really seen it. Not like this. Not walking the streets, watching the people, feeling the atmosphere. Sullivan was white, Irish, obviously not from around here. In 1948, that meant something. Harlem was segregated. Not by law, New York didn't have Jim Crow, but by reality. Black people lived in Harlem because they couldn't live anywhere else. Banks wouldn't give them loans for houses in white neighborhoods. Employers wouldn't hire them for certain jobs. The system kept them contained, controlled. And inside that containment, they'd built something remarkable. Sullivan walked down Lenox Avenue, jazz music spilling out of clubs. The Cotton Club, Small's Paradise, Minton's Playhouse. Barbershops crowded with men talking, laughing. Women in their Sunday best, despite it being Wednesday. Kids playing stickball in the street. It wasn't what Sullivan expected. He expected decay, desperation, the visual signs of criminal control. Instead, he saw community, pride, life. Sullivan stopped in a barbershop. 3 barbers, 6 chairs. Everyone filled. He waited his turn. Listened. The men talked about baseball, about jobs, about their kids. And eventually, someone mentioned Bumpy. You hear about what Mr. Johnson did for the Williams family? What happened? Their boy got accepted to college, Howard University, full ride. But they needed money for books, supplies, travel. Couldn't afford it. Mr. Johnson heard about it, paid for everything, didn't ask for nothing back. Sullivan's ears perked up. He tried to sound casual. This Mr. Johnson, Bumpy Johnson. The barbershop went quiet. Everyone looked at him. Sullivan realized his mistake. White reporter, asking about Bumpy. In a Harlem barbershop. One of the barbers spoke. Voice careful, measured. You a cop? No. Journalist. New York Tribune. What you want to know about Mr. Johnson? Sullivan hesitated, then decided on honesty. I'm writing a story about him. About his operations. The numbers game. The barber nodded. Went back to cutting hair. You won't find nobody in Harlem to say nothing bad about Mr. Johnson. Why not? Because he protects us. When nobody else does. Sullivan tried again. But the gambling. You think we got choices? The barber's voice was sharp now. You think we can walk into a bank and get a loan? You think the police protect us when white gangs come around? You think the city cares if we eat or not? Mr. Johnson does. That's why we protect him. Same way he protects us. Sullivan left the barber shop without getting a haircut. His notebook had one line. They're not afraid of him. They're loyal to him. That didn't match the file on his desk. Victims don't protect their oppressors, unless they're not victims. Sullivan spent the rest of the day walking Harlem, talking to people, asking questions. Every single person said some version of the same thing. Mr. Johnson helps people. Mr. Johnson keeps us safe. Mr. Johnson is the only one who cares. By 6 p.m., Sullivan was confused. He'd come to Harlem looking for evidence of exploitation. Instead, he found evidence of, what? Protection? Community service? That night, Sullivan made another decision. He needed to talk to Bumpy Johnson himself, not through intermediaries, not through police reports. Face to face. That's when things got complicated. October 15th, 1948. Sullivan spent the entire day trying to find someone who would speak on the record about Bumpy Johnson. Not anonymous quotes. Real names. Real testimony. The kind of evidence that would hold up in court. Or in a newspaper article. He found plenty of people willing to talk, just not about what he wanted. First stop, Mrs. Rosa Chen, who ran a small grocery store on 132nd Street. Sullivan introduced himself, showed his press credentials. Mrs. Chen, I'm writing about organized crime in Harlem, specifically about Bumpy Johnson and the numbers racket. Can you tell me about your experience with his operations? Mrs. Chen was 54 years old, Chinese immigrant. Had run that grocery store for 18 years. She looked at Sullivan for a long moment. Then she said, Mr. Johnson saved my store. Sullivan pulled out his notebook. How do you mean? 1943. 5 years ago, Italian men came, said I needed protection. $50 a week, or they burn my store. I couldn't pay. I have 3 children. That money is their food. They came back, threw brick through my window, said next time it's gasoline. I was going to close, move back to Chinatown, too scared. Then Mr. Johnson came to my store, said he heard what happened, said nobody extorts businesses in Harlem, not on his watch. The Italian men never came back. And Mr. Johnson? He never asked me for a penny. Not one time in 5 years. Sullivan wrote this down, then asked, But doesn't he run illegal gambling? Isn't that also extortion? Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. You want to know about extortion? The landlord who charges me triple what he charges white businesses downtown. That's extortion. The banks that won't give me a loan because of my skin. That's extortion. The police who ignore when my store gets robbed but arrest my son for standing on the corner. That's extortion. Mr. Johnson, he lets people play numbers if they want. Nobody forces them. And when they win, he pays. Every time. You want to write about crime? Write about the real criminals. The ones wearing badges and suits. Sullivan left without the quote he wanted. Second stop, Reverend James Powell, pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church. Surely a man of God would speak honestly about a gangster in his community. Reverend Powell was 68 years old, had been pastor for 30 years, respected throughout Harlem. Sullivan asked him directly, Reverend, what's your opinion of Bumpy Johnson? The Reverend sat back in his chair. Young man, you're asking the wrong question. What should I ask? You should ask, why does Bumpy Johnson exist? I don't understand. The Reverend smiled sadly. In 1935, I had a young man in my congregation. Bright boy, straight A's. Got accepted to Columbia University. First in his family to go to college. His family was poor, very poor. Father worked 3 jobs. Mother cleaned houses. Still couldn't afford tuition. I went to every bank in New York, begged them for a loan. The boy had perfect grades, perfect references, perfect everything. Every bank said no. You know why? Sullivan stayed quiet. Because he was black. That's it. That's the only reason. "I came back to tell the family," the boy cried. His father cried. Their American dream died that day. 2 days later, Bumpy Johnson showed up at their house, said he heard about the situation, gave them an envelope, $2,000, full tuition, said, "Pay me back when you can, and when you graduate, come back to Harlem, help your people." That boy graduated Columbia in 1939, became a doctor, opened a clinic right here in Harlem, served this community for 40 years. Bumpy Johnson made that possible. Not the banks, not the government, not the church. Bumpy. The Reverend leaned forward. "So when you ask me about Bumpy Johnson, I say this: judge him against the system that created him, not against some ideal that never existed for people like us." Sullivan left the church more confused than when he arrived. Third stop, Officer Daniel Murphy, NYPD, Irish, like Sullivan. Finally, someone who might give him the story he needed. Murphy was off duty. Sullivan met him at a bar in Midtown. "Danny, I'm working on the Bumpy Johnson story. What can you tell me?" Murphy laughed. "You want me to talk about Bumpy? On the record?" "Off the record, then." Murphy took a drink, looked around to make sure nobody was listening. "Off the record? Bumpy Johnson is the only reason Harlem hasn't exploded." "What do you mean?" "You know how many times the Italians tried to take over Harlem? The Genovese family? The Lucchese family. They wanted the numbers racket, wanted to control the whole neighborhood. Bumpy stopped them. Every single time. You know what would have happened if the Italians took over? Blood. Everywhere. They don't care about community. They'd have turned Harlem into a war zone. Bumpy keeps the peace. Yeah, he runs numbers. But nobody gets hurt. Nobody gets killed. Businesses stay open. Kids stay safe." Sullivan pressed. "But he's breaking the law." Murphy laughed again. Bitter this time. "Breaking the law? Let me tell you about breaking the law. Last month, 3 white cops from the Bronx came to Harlem, off-duty, drunk, started harassing people, beating up black men for fun. I was on patrol, saw it happening, called for backup. You know what my sergeant said? Let them blow off steam, don't make a fuss. You know who stopped them? Bumpy's guys. Surrounded those cops, didn't touch them, just stood there, made it clear, not in Harlem. Those cops left, haven't come back. So yeah, Bumpy breaks the law. But he also protects people. The law doesn't protect. You want to write about crime, write about the cops who take bribes, the landlords who exploit tenants, the system that makes guys like Bumpy necessary. Sullivan went home that night with 20 pages of notes. Not one person would condemn Bumpy Johnson on the record. Not the business owners he supposedly extorted. Not the pastor whose congregation he supposedly corrupted. Not even the cop whose job was to arrest him. Something was wrong with Sullivan's story. Or something was wrong with his understanding of the story. October 16th, 1948. Sullivan decided he needed to meet Bumpy Johnson, face to face. Ask him directly. The problem: you don't just call Bumpy Johnson's office and make an appointment. He didn't have an office, didn't have a listed number, operated in the shadows, but Harlem knew where to find him. Sullivan went back to the barber shop. Same barber from 2 days ago. "I need to meet Bumpy Johnson." The barber didn't look up from his work. "Why would Mr. Johnson want to meet you?" "Because I'm writing about him, and I'd rather hear his side before I publish." The barber considered this, then nodded. "Come back tonight, 9 p.m. Someone will take you." Sullivan came back at 9 p.m. A young man was waiting outside the barber shop, maybe 20 years old, well-dressed. "Mr. Sullivan?" "Yes." "Mr. Johnson will see you. Follow me." They walked 3 blocks. Down Lenox Avenue, past Small's Paradise, past the Apollo Theater, to a brownstone on 139th Street. Quiet street. Residential. Nothing special. The young man knocked. 3 times. Pause. 2 times. The door opened. Inside. Elegant. Not ostentatious. Just refined. Hardwood floors. Artwork on the walls. Bookshelf full of actual books, not decorations. They went to the 2nd floor. A study. And there, sitting in a leather chair, reading a book, Bumpy Johnson, 43 years old, tall, maybe 6'1", lean, wearing an expensive suit, impeccable. He looked up when Sullivan entered. "Mr. Sullivan, New York Tribune. Have a seat." Sullivan sat, notebook out. Bumpy closed his book. Sullivan could see the title, The Prince by Machiavelli. "You've been asking questions about me," Bumpy said, voice calm, almost gentle. "Yes, I'm writing a story." "I know. I heard what kind of story. And I'm curious what you found." Sullivan hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I found that nobody in Harlem will say anything bad about you. Even though my research shows you run an illegal gambling operation that generates $500,000 a year." Bumpy smiled. "Your research is outdated. It's closer to $700,000 now." Sullivan's pen stopped. "You're admitting it? Why wouldn't I? You already know. The police know. So why don't they arrest you?" "Because the numbers game isn't the crime, Mr. Sullivan. The crime is the system that makes the numbers game necessary." Bumpy stood, walked to the window. "Let me ask you something. You're Irish, yes?" "Yes." "Your grandparents came to America. Faced discrimination?" "No." "Irish need apply. Signs in windows. Doors closed. Opportunities denied. But your father worked, saved money, got a loan, bought a house, sent you to school. You became a reporter. Respectable job. That's the American dream, right? Hard work pays off?" Sullivan nodded. "Now let me tell you about the Black American dream." Bumpy turned to face him. "My father worked 3 jobs. Saved every penny for 20 years. Tried to buy a house in Queens. The bank said no, not because of his credit, because of his skin. He tried to send me to a good school. They said no. Not because of my grades, because of my skin. He tried to get a business loan. They said no, not because of his business plan, because of his skin. The American dream works for you, Mr. Sullivan. It doesn't work for me. So I built my own dream. And yes, it's illegal. But do you know what else is illegal?" Bumpy's voice hardened slightly. "Banks that refuse loans to black people. That's illegal, but nobody gets arrested. Landlords who charge us triple for housing. That's illegal, but nobody gets arrested. Police who beat us in the streets. That's illegal, but nobody gets arrested. So forgive me if I don't lose sleep over running a numbers game that lets my people have hope," Sullivan wrote furiously. "But you're making money off that hope." "Yes, and I use that money to send kids to college, to pay rent for families facing eviction, to protect businesses from extortion, to keep the Italian mob out of Harlem. The city won't do those things. The state won't do those things. So I do them. Am I a criminal? Yes. By the law's definition, absolutely. Am I necessary? Ask the 200 families I've helped this year. Ask the 50 kids whose education I've funded. Ask the businesses I've protected. Then ask yourself, if I disappeared tomorrow, would Harlem be better off?" Sullivan had no answer. Bumpy sat back down. "Write your story, Mr. Sullivan. But write the whole story. Not just the parts that fit your narrative." Sullivan looked at his notes. At this man who admitted to crimes but defended them with philosophy. "Can I ask you something off the record?" "Go ahead. Do you ever feel guilty?" Bumpy was quiet for a moment. "Every day. Because I know what I do is wrong. By society's laws, by moral standards, It's wrong. But I also know that if I stop, the void will be filled by someone worse. The Italians, the corrupt cops, the loan sharks who don't care if your grandmother starves. So I keep going, not because I'm a hero, because I'm the least bad option Harlem has. That's when Sullivan understood. He wasn't interviewing a villain. He was interviewing a man created by villains. A man who'd turned oppression into opportunity. A man who'd built an illegal empire because the legal one was closed to him. That's when Bumpy told Sullivan the story that changed everything. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. Let me tell you about Sarah Mitchell. Sullivan's pen was ready. Sarah was 8 years old, lived on 128th Street. Smart kid, loved to read, wanted to be a teacher. Her father worked at the docks. Her mother cleaned houses. Together, they made maybe $30 a week. That's $1,500 a year. In the winter of 1945, Sarah got sick. Pneumonia. Bad. Her parents took her to Harlem Hospital. The doctor said she needed medicine. Penicillin. New drug. Very effective, but expensive. $50 for the treatment. The family didn't have $50. They'd spent everything on rent and food. The father went to his boss, begged for an advance. Boss said no. Mother went to the church. Church collection that month, $12. Not enough. Father went to a bank, asked for a loan. Bank looked at his race, his address, said no. Bumpy's voice was quiet now. Sarah died on a Wednesday, February 14th, 1945, because her family couldn't get $50. I was at a jazz club that night. Someone told me about it. I didn't know the family, never met them. I went to their apartment anyway. 2 days after Sarah died, the father was sitting in the kitchen. Just sitting, staring at nothing. I gave him an envelope. $500 for the funeral, for the medical bills they'd accumulated, for food. He looked at me, said, "Where were you 3 days ago?" I had no answer, because he was right. I was 3 days too late. Bumpy stood, walked to a drawer, pulled out a photograph. He handed it to Sullivan, a little girl, 8 years old, smiling, school uniform, beautiful. Sarah Mitchell. I keep this photo as a reminder. Of what? That I'm not a hero. That I'm a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. That no matter how much money I make, how many families I help, there will always be a Sarah Mitchell I miss. That's why I do what I do, Mr. Sullivan. Not because I'm good, because the alternative is unacceptable. Sullivan looked at the photo. This little girl who died because the system failed. Bumpy continued. After Sarah died, I made a decision. I started a fund, anonymous. No names, no credit. Any family in Harlem facing a medical emergency they can't afford, the fund pays. In 3 years, that fund has helped 47 families. 47 people who didn't die because they were poor. The money comes from the numbers racket, from illegal gambling, from crime. So tell me, Mr. Sullivan, is that money dirty, or is it the cleanest thing in Harlem? Sullivan didn't write anything. He just sat there, looking at a photo of a dead little girl, understanding that he'd been asking the wrong questions. He wasn't here to expose a criminal. He was here to understand a system so broken that criminals had to fix it. Bumpy took the photo back. Put it carefully in the drawer. I'll tell you one more story. Then you can go write whatever you want. In 1943, the Italians tried to take over Harlem. Genovese family. They wanted the numbers game. Their method was simple. Violence. They beat up operators, burned down policy banks, killed 2 men in 3 weeks. They told me, "Step aside, or we'll kill you too." I didn't step aside. I fought back. For 2 months, it was war. You know why I fought? Not for the money, not for power. Because I knew what would happen if the Italians won. They'd raise the prices. They'd exploit the community. They'd turn Harlem into a colony. I kept them out. The violence stopped. Harlem stayed ours. The police did nothing. The city did nothing. I did everything. Now you tell me, am I a criminal for running numbers, or am I a criminal for protecting my community when nobody else would? Sullivan closed his notebook. He came to Harlem to write an exposé. He found something else entirely. A man who was guilty of everything the law said he was, and innocent of everything the community accused him of being. Bumpy walked Sullivan to the door. Write your story. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Why? Because you came here. You asked questions. You listened. Most reporters don't do that. They write what they already decided to write before they started. You actually want to understand. That's rare. That's valuable. Sullivan left that brownstone at 11:32 p.m. He walked back to 125th Street, took the subway home to Brooklyn. The entire ride, he stared at his notebook. 20 pages of interviews, 50 pages of police records, one photo of a dead little girl, and a question that wouldn't leave his mind. If Bumpy Johnson is the villain, who's the hero? The answer was, there wasn't one, because heroes require a just system to operate in. And in 1948, Harlem, that system didn't exist. October 17th, 1948. 11:37 p.m. Back to where we started. Sullivan at his desk. Typewriter, coffee, cigarettes, and a choice. He had two versions of the story in his head. Version 1. The exposé. Bumpy Johnson, criminal empire, built on exploitation. Show the arrests. Show the illegal operation. Show the money. Expose him as what he legally was. A gangster. A racketeer. A criminal who'd escaped justice for decades. It would be a good story. A safe story. The story his editor wanted. The story that would probably win awards. But it would be incomplete. Version 2. The truth. Bumpy Johnson. The man the system created. Show the context. Show the discrimination. Show the failures of banks, police, government. Show Bumpy not as a villain, but as a symptom of a disease. It would be a controversial story. A complicated story. A story that would make people uncomfortable. The story that might get him fired. But it would be honest. Sullivan thought about everything he'd learned. Mrs. Chen's grocery store. Saved from extortion. The boy who went to Columbia on Bumpy's money and became a doctor. Sarah Mitchell, who died because $50 was too expensive. The 47 families whose medical bills were paid by illegal gambling money. He thought about Reverend Powell's question. Why does Bumpy Johnson exist? And he realized, Bumpy Johnson exists because the system is broken. Banks that won't lend to black people. Employers who won't hire them. Police who won't protect them. A government that promises equality but delivers segregation. Into that void stepped Bumpy Johnson. Criminal? Yes. Necessary? Also yes. Sullivan pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, rolled it into the typewriter, started typing, but not the story he'd planned. He wrote about Sarah Mitchell, the 8-year-old who died because her parents couldn't get a $50 loan. He wrote about the Columbia graduate who became a doctor, funded by illegal gambling money because legal institutions said no. He wrote about Mrs. Chen's grocery store, protected by a criminal because police wouldn't do it. He wrote about the system that created Bumpy Johnson, not to excuse him, but to explain him. And in explaining him, Sullivan did something radical for 1948. He asked readers to question who the real criminals were. The man running illegal gambling in Harlem? Or the banks that wouldn't give loans to black families? The man who sent kids to college with illegal money? Or the universities that wouldn't admit them until someone like Bumpy paid their way? The man who protected businesses from extortion? Or the police who ignored that extortion when it came from white gangs? Sullivan typed for 3 hours straight. By 2:47 a.m., he had his story. It wasn't the story he came to write. It was better. It was honest. The next morning, Sullivan walked into his editor's office. James Crawford, 62 years old, editor for 30 years. No nonsense. You got the Bumpy Johnson story? Yes. Good. We run it Sunday. Front page. Harlem's criminal king or something like that. Sullivan put the article on Crawford's desk. It's not that story. Crawford picked it up, started reading. His expression changed. Slowly. From expectation to confusion, to something else. He read for 10 minutes. Didn't say a word. Finally, "This isn't what I asked for. I know. I wanted you to expose him. I did. But I also exposed the system that created him." Crawford leaned back. "You're saying Bumpy Johnson is justified. I'm saying Bumpy Johnson is inevitable. When you build a system that denies people legal opportunities, they'll create illegal ones. That's not our job. Our job is to report crime. Our job is to report truth. And the truth is that Bumpy Johnson wouldn't exist if the system worked for black people the way it works for white people." Crawford stared at Sullivan. "You know what happens if we run this? We'll get letters. Angry letters. Tribune defends criminals. Or we'll start a conversation about why criminals like Bumpy Johnson exist in the first place." Crawford read the article again. Longer this time. At 11:23 a.m., he made his decision. "We run it. Sunday, front page. But we're adding an editor's note. The views expressed in this article are those of the reporter and do not necessarily reflect the Tribune's position." Fair enough. The article ran Sunday, October 19th, 1948. Front page. Headline: "The King of Harlem, a criminal, the system created." It was the most read article the Tribune published that year, and the most controversial. The article Sullivan wrote wasn't what anyone expected. Here's how it opened. Sarah Mitchell was 8 years old when she died. The cause of death was pneumonia. The real cause was poverty, and the system that makes poverty a death sentence. Her parents tried everything. Begged their employer, asked the church, went to a bank. All said no. Sarah died on February 14th, 1945. 3 days later, a man they'd never met gave them $500. Too late to save Sarah, but enough to bury her with dignity. That man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, criminal, gangster, king of Harlem, and the only person who tried to help. The article continued for 3,000 words. Sullivan detailed Bumpy's illegal operations, the numbers racket, the money, the arrests. He didn't hide the crime, didn't excuse it, but he provided context. He wrote about the banks that refused loans to black families, the police, who ignored crimes against black businesses, the government programs that excluded black people by design. He wrote about Harlem as a community abandoned by legitimate institutions. And into that abandonment stepped Bumpy Johnson. Criminal? Yes. But also provider, protector, problem solver. Sullivan interviewed 15 people for the article, used their real names with permission. Mrs. Chen, whose grocery store was protected. Reverend Powell, who'd seen Bumpy send kids to college. Dr. James Wilson, the Columbia graduate who returned to serve Harlem. Officer Murphy, who admitted the police couldn't keep Harlem safe without Bumpy's cooperation. Every interview painted the same picture. Bumpy Johnson was guilty of breaking laws, but he was innocent of the things people accused him of: exploiting his community, terrorizing residents, corrupting youth. In fact, he did the opposite. The reaction was immediate. Letters poured in. Some praised Sullivan for telling the truth. Finally, someone who understands what we face. Others condemned him. The Tribune defends criminals now. Police commissioners called the article dangerous propaganda. Civil rights leaders called it necessary truth. White readers were outraged. How dare you defend a gangster? Black readers were grateful. Thank you for seeing us as human. The article did something rare in 1948 journalism. It forced people to think about systems, not just individuals. To ask, not just, what did Bumpy Johnson do, but why did Bumpy Johnson exist? 3 weeks after publication, Sullivan received a letter. No return address. Postmarked Harlem. Inside, a single sentence. Thank you for seeing the whole picture, E.J. Ellsworth Johnson. Bumpy had read the article and approved. Sullivan framed that letter, kept it on his wall for the rest of his career. A reminder that journalism isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding complexity. It's about seeing people, even criminals, as products of their environment. It's about asking uncomfortable questions. Like, if the system worked, would Bumpy Johnson have needed to exist? The answer was no. And that was the real story. Sullivan's article changed journalism. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But slowly, it shifted how reporters covered crime in black communities. Before 1948, crime stories in Harlem were simple. Negro criminal arrested. After Sullivan, some reporters started asking, why is crime so prevalent here? Some started investigating the banks that refused loans, the landlords who exploited tenants, the police who brutalized residents, the system that created the criminals it condemned. Sullivan won awards for that article. The Polk Award for Journalism, the Pulitzer Prize, not because he defended Bumpy Johnson, because he exposed the system that made Bumpy Johnson necessary. But here's what people forget. The article didn't change Bumpy's status. He was still a criminal, still arrested periodically, still operating outside the law. What it changed was perception. People started seeing Bumpy not as an anomaly, a bad man doing bad things, but as a symptom, a capable man doing illegal things because legal opportunities didn't exist. That distinction matters, because it shifts responsibility from Bumpy Johnson is the problem to the system that creates Bumpy Johnson is the problem. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, 20 years after Sullivan's article. His funeral was attended by thousands, not just criminals, community leaders, business owners, families he'd helped, and one white reporter from Brooklyn, Michael Sullivan, who came to pay respects to a man he'd once planned to destroy. Sullivan gave a brief statement to other reporters at the funeral. I came to Harlem in 1948 to expose a villain. I found something more complicated. A man shaped by injustice who chose to fight injustice using the only tools available to him. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. Let's not pretend otherwise. But he was also necessary. And that's not his failure. That's ours. Ours as a society that denied people opportunities based on race. Ours as institutions, banks, police, government that failed to serve everyone equally. Ours as a country that forced brilliant men like Bumpy Johnson to choose between poverty and crime. If there's a lesson from Bumpy's life, it's this. Heroes and villains aren't born. They're created by the systems we build. We built a system that made Bumpy Johnson inevitable. We should fix that system so the next generation doesn't need another Bumpy Johnson. Sullivan died in 1987. Age half years. Complications from lung cancer. Too many cigarettes in too many newsrooms. In his obituary, the New York Times mentioned that Pulitzer Prize. The article about Bumpy Johnson. But they missed the bigger point. Sullivan's legacy wasn't exposing a criminal. It was exposing the system that creates criminals, and asking the question we still need to ask today. When people have no legal path to survival, dignity, and opportunity. Can we really call them criminals for finding illegal ones? Or should we call ourselves criminals for building a system that gives them no choice? That's the question Sullivan forced readers to confront in 1948. It's the question we're still confronting today. And it's the reason his article about a Harlem gangster became one of the most important pieces of journalism of the 20th century. Not because it defended crime, because it demanded we understand why crime happens, and who's really responsible for it. October 17th, 1948, 11:47 p.m. Michael Sullivan sat at his desk with a file full of evidence against Bumpy Johnson. By 2:47 a.m., he'd written an article that changed journalism. This is the story of what happened in between. A reporter who came to expose a criminal and discovered that exposure isn't the same as truth. That complexity is more honest than simplicity. That heroes and villains are labels we use to avoid asking hard questions about the systems we've built. Sullivan learned something in Harlem that every journalist should learn. The story you plan to write is rarely the story you should write. Because people are complicated, systems are complicated, and truth requires understanding, not just evidence. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. That's a fact. But he was also a product of his environment. A man denied legitimate opportunities who created illegitimate ones. A man who used crime to do what the government refused to do, help his community survive. Does that excuse his crimes? No. Does it explain them? Yes. And explanation is the first step towards solving the problem. Because here's what Sullivan understood by the end. The real story wasn't Bumpy Johnson is a criminal. Everyone already knew that. The real story was, why does Harlem need Bumpy Johnson more than it needs the police? That's the uncomfortable question. That's the question that forces us to look at ourselves, at our banks, our police, our government, our laws, at the systems we've built that work for some people and fail others. Bumpy Johnson existed because the system was broken. Fix the system, and you won't need Bumpy Johnson. That's not defending crime. That's understanding it. And understanding is the first step toward justice. Real justice. Not the kind that arrests people, the kind that makes arrests unnecessary. If this story changed how you think about crime and justice, hit that subscribe button. We're telling the complicated stories, the uncomfortable stories, the stories that don't have easy answers. Drop a comment. If you were Sullivan, would you have written the exposé or the truth? Would you have defended your career or your conscience? Hit the like button if you think journalists should expose systems, not just individuals. Turn on notifications because next week we're covering another story about Bumpy Johnson. The time he walked into a police station unarmed and walked out with an apology. How one man forced the NYPD to admit they were wrong. You won't want to miss it. Remember, Michael Sullivan came to Harlem to expose a villain. He left understanding that villains are created by systems, and the real criminals are the people who build those systems and pretend they're just. This is Harlem Chronicles, telling the stories they don't want you to know, the complicated ones, the true ones. Rest in power, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, and rest in power, Michael Sullivan. Two men who taught us that truth is more important than narrative, and understanding is more valuable than judgment. We'll see you in the next one.